There is nothing so wonderful in the world as telling stories.
Tous les matins, on essaye de traverser le miroir et de regarder le monde différemment.
It is true, I am a woman.
Une fois que ce saut est fait, tout devient possible.
Hello, I'm Charlotte Casiraghi. Welcome to the podcast of Les Rendezvous littéraires Rue Cambon, a place where we meet to talk about writing, to talk about books. Let's meet women writers who have just taken their first step, the most decisive, the most difficult in the world of literature. How did their vocation call to them? What are their writing rituals? Who reads them and what do they read?
I'm Erica Wagner, and it's my pleasure to introduce Lauren Elkin and welcome her to Chanel's podcast, Les Rencontres. We're here to talk about Lauren's debut novel, Scaffolding, has just been published. It's an entrancing, fascinating book set in Paris, a city where she lived for many years. The story exists in two time frames. In 2019, Anna and David have moved into an apartment in Belleville, the once working-class neighbourhood that was the birthplace of Edith Piaf and the setting of the films of Eric Rohmer, one of the cultural figures who haunts this story. Anna is a psychoanalyst and David a lawyer working in London. She has had a miscarriage and suffered a breakdown. But we come to know this same apartment in 1972, when it is inhabited by Florence and Henry. She is training to be an analyst, he is a paralegal. Both couples are having their kitchen redone. Both couples are struggling to integrate the thought of children into their married lives, are debating the meaning of fidelity, are being drawn by forces they don't quite understand. The building, the locale, are characters in this mysterious, engaging tale too, a tale which takes on the seismic shifts disrupting French life in its two eras, the Me Too movement, the legalization of abortion. It is an accomplished book and no wonder. The novelist Deborah Levy has called Lauren Elkin one of our most valuable critical thinkers, the Susan Sontag of her generation. Lauren grew up in Long Island, New York, and has lived in Tokyo and Venice as well as Paris. She now lives in London. Her first book, Flâneuse, Women Walk the City in Paris, New York, Tokyo, Venice, and London, was shortlisted for the Penn Diamonstein Spielvogel Award for the Art of the Essay. Her translations from French include The Bedroom, An Intimate History by Michel Perrault, and, with Charlotte Mandel, A Life of Jean Cocteau by Claude Arnaud, which won the French-American Foundation's Translation Prize. Number 9192, Notes on a Parisian Commute, was published in 2021 and was written on the bus to and from work while teaching at the American University of Paris. It is a love letter, you might say, both to her adopted city and the humans who inhabit it. Last year, she published Art Monsters, Unruly Bodies in Feminist Art, which interrogated the boundary-breaking work and lives of creative women across cultures. She is one of our most original and interesting writers when it comes to thinking about women's lives. I'm delighted to be speaking with her today. Welcome, Lauren Elkin.
Thank you, Erica. Thanks for having me.
I'd love to start by talking about your beginnings as a writer. You grew up in New York, but I feel you've always been a traveler. How has that influenced your work?
I think it started quite early, actually. When I think back to my very, very beginnings as a writer, I was writing like Les Miserables fan fiction, you know, where Gavroche doesn't actually die and Eponine gets Marius and everybody's happy. So I think I was always looking elsewhere and to France specifically. But yeah, I think, you know, what you said, the quote that Deborah Levy so generously gave about my work, that I'm a gifted critical thinker, I guess, has something to do with why fiction was interesting to me, because I think you can spend lots of time thinking and reading and commenting and synthesizing and getting people to read about, quote unquote, the real world. But it's just as worthwhile to start thinking critically about our lives and our love lives and our desires and the way that we live with other people. And I think that was really the sort of kernel of the attraction to fiction from the get-go.
Well, my next question connects very much to that, because I was going to ask you, why do you think fiction is so good at exploring these questions of the philosophy of living?
I think there's something about fiction. I mean, this is, sort of a truism. I'm not the first to say this, but obviously we'd like to talk about fiction as a kind of exercise in empathy or an attempt to put ourselves in other people's lives and see what it's like there. And I think that's probably one of the greatest challenges of being a fiction writer, is trying to imagine, how do other people live enough to actually convincingly write as another person. But I think that writing fiction after many years of reading and writing about fiction is just like an amazing opportunity to put that muscle to work, if that makes any sense.
As I mentioned in my introduction, the book exists in 2 time frames. How did you come to that decision, that way of working?
I was really influenced by a novel by Elizabeth Bowen, the Anglo-Irish writer, called The House in Paris, which was published in 1935, which has a really brilliant kind of novelistic structure. It's told in 3 parts. Parts 1 and 3 are set in the present day, meaning the early 30s. And part 2 flashes back to 10 years earlier to try to look at the circumstances through which the current day conditions came to be. And I loved the fact that it takes place in a house, and it's very structured like, the stories of a house, but it collapses the house in on itself and the novel as well. And so I always knew that I wanted to write almost like 3 novellas that fit together, as if, life were going on the different floors of a building, and the people who were living there didn't necessarily know anything about what was happening on the other floors, except, I guess, for the people on floor 3. They know about floor 1. But yeah, Bowen is a writer who has meant a lot to me, and something about reading her very deeply for my PhD back in the mid to late noughties, just, I don't know, really shaped the way that I thought about fiction writing itself.
It's also set in a very specific neighborhood in Paris. It's set in Belleville. And one of the things I loved about this book is it felt like being in Paris. That's one of the wonderful things about this novel. But why Belleville? Of course, Eric Romer, the filmmaker, set his films there. Was that what drew you to that place?
Not really. I think when I started spending a lot of time in Paris, I moved there for good in 2004 after living back and forth between Paris and New York for a few years. Belleville was very much up and coming. There were a lot of young people moving there, including lots of my friends, lots of cafes and bars and bookshops and galleries. It was just becoming a kind of destination, a bit like Brooklyn was at that point. And I don't know, I think there's an amazing, really rich history to Belleville of people from different places coming to live there together, side by side. It's set at a place in Paris where 4 different arrondissements come together, and I think that that's also very symbolic. There's a texture about Belleville that I found fascinating, that I, just went down a rabbit hole researching its history and thinking about the different people who've lived there and what it would have been like for them to live through so many different transitions and transformations in the landscape of the city. Yeah, I mean, it should be said that it's not the Paris of like monuments and wealthy people. And, early in the novel, the main character remembers her childhood spent visiting Angelina's and having their really thick chocolate pudding. It's not Angelina's Paris. It's very much like a kind of working class neighborhood where there are lots of people from different places coming together.
Well, even in the title, Scaffolding, and the way that the characters in the book are oppressed by building works and change taking place around them, you really feel the texture of what I'd call a lived city, not just an observed
Yeah,
city.
completely. It really bothers me when people call Paris a museum city, because that might be true for certain neighborhoods, although I would argue that it's not actually true for those neighborhoods either. But it's certainly not the case in Belleville. It's really a place that, especially in the last 50, 60 years or so, the period of time that the novel encompasses, it's undergone extreme changes from being a place full of very, very poor kind of refugees from Eastern Europe and very working class Parisians living in a kind of recognizably Parisian village with, les bals guignettes, like little like music halls and drinking dens and, being places of sort of ill repute, into a place where now you can go to very chic cocktail bars and get a mixologist mixing something for you that's like vaguely medicinal but also feels very fancy.
Smokes when they serve it to you. How was the process of bringing this book into the world different than publishing nonfiction? How did your agent react? What does it feel like to be putting fiction into the world rather than nonfiction, of course, is just as creative, but in such a different way?
It's so different. It's amazing because in a novel, or at least in the novels that I feel drawn to writing, you can put a woman in a room and leave her there, as I do, but the whole world filters in through her reading, through her engagement with the internet, through the random people who come to visit her. It almost feels like the process of researching a book becomes a character and a place, and you can still get at all kinds of ideas, but you're doing it, I guess it's almost like a double for the researcher who's alone in the library, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I remember giving it to my agent, like, I want to say 2017 or so. She was saying, so what's next? Flaneuse was great. What can we see next from Lauren Elkin? And I was like, it's a novel. I've been writing it for a really long time, and I'd really like to finish it. And she was really pleasantly surprised, and so were my editors at Chatto. And so, I feel very vulnerable, I have to say, publishing it, a work of nonfiction. For me, to date, maybe there's been some personal writing in there, but mostly they've been, works that have been very deeply researched, very carefully structured and argued. And then this novel is, it just feels like here are some things that I think about love.
How do you pull together your literary and cultural influences for a book like this? The psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan has a role to play in this book. We've mentioned the filmmaker Eric Romer. There's all kinds of influences pouring very subtly into this book. How conscious, how intuitive was that process?
I think because I'm a researcher and I love the practice of being led from one person to another person to another person, I had to be really careful about that and not to bog the novel down with too many different references. I was coming off the back of Art Monsters, which is a book just crammed full of references. So I was trying to think about what if I came across something in in someone else's bibliography, and had a sort of temptation to bring it in and to think how is this serving the story? How is this helping us to understand these characters and what they're going through? The book is, in a sense, because I wrote it over a period of 16 years, a kind of geographical strata of all of the various obsessions that I've had over the years. So there's a French psychoanalyst called Nathalie Zajde, whose work I was very preoccupied with in 2007. So she's in there. Lacan, my engagement with him really changed and shifted over that period of time as I read more of his work, as I started to understand it more, I hope, more profoundly. There's always a little asterisk there with Lacan, I think I understand it. Here's what I've gleaned. But yeah, I had to be really careful not to let everything that was interesting to me creep its way into the book.
And both the female characters in their different time frames are, I want to say, in the realm of psychoanalysis. Mm-hmm. Why is that profession or that search important to them as characters?
I think for Florence, who is the daughter of and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and the wife of someone whose parents and grandparents were also Holocaust survivors, although I hesitate to say survivors because some of them didn't survive much longer after the camps. And I think, at least for those characters in 1972, or for Florence specifically, she just wants to understand what happened. She's someone who had, and this is something that I took from Nathalie Zajde, dreams the same traumatized dreams that her grandmother dreamed, and without her grandmother having ever told her what the dream was. And so there's something kind of mysterious there about the way that trauma can be transmitted down the generations and the ways in which the younger generations absorb things without being told them. And so specifically, Lacanian psychoanalysis, I think, is interested in what happens beneath the surface of language. Language is itself, the unconscious is structured like a language, Lacan says. So language is a kind of pointing out of what's happening beneath. It's a kind of symptom. It's telling you, you can listen for the gaps or the slippages, and that will tell you something interesting. But Lacan was famous for ending a séance, ending a session sometimes in the middle of a sentence, or after 3 minutes or something. If you were having a phone conversation with him, he'd hang up the phone and you'd be left going, okay, I guess our session is over. And that was because he didn't want you to bring too much into your conscious mind. He thought perhaps you were on the verge of discovering something interesting, and he didn't want you to discover it in language. He wanted it to stay in the realm of the mind. Anyway, so that's a little bit. It's partly why there's so many blank spaces on the page in the book. Sometimes just a sentence is enough, and then that leaves room for the reader to be absorbing it on the level of their unconscious as well. Anyway, I could go on and on.
That's really fascinating. I'd love to invite you now to just read the opening of Scaffolding.
Okay. The day I met Clémentine was the day after she moved in. She was standing outside the bottle green door to our building, punching different combinations into the keypad protecting the entryway. Bulging plastic bags dangled from the crooks of her elbows. I was dripping with sweat from my morning run. The August heat was intense. 21B12, I say twice before she hears me. The door clicks open. I was afraid I'd have to wait for hours out here for someone to come out, Clémentine says, with a nervous laugh. She's tall, but somehow delicate. Small nose, blonde hair. The gardienne would have let you in if you had buzzed her, I say. Madame Vasquez, she lives right there. I gesture at the concierge's home on the ground floor, in case it happens again. Oh, I thought I might remember it sooner or later. I have a funny memory like that. Things disappear until I happen to bump up against the right drawer in my brain, and then it pops open, and there it is, the thing I was looking for. Clémentine had just moved in with her boyfriend Jonathan, she tells me, as we stand in front of the mailboxes. They live in Building B. My husband and I live in Building A. We speak for a few moments about moving and movers, learn each other's names. I look at my watch. I'm sorry, but I have an appointment soon, and I have to jump in the shower. Why don't you come over for tea sometime this week?
Thank you so much. I'd like to talk to you a little bit now about process and how you make your work. Let's start by hearing about your writing day. What happens when you sit down? What do you like around you? Do you have set times? Do you write at any time?
I drop my son off at school in the morning, and then I sit down on the couch in the front room, and I try not to get straight to email or commissions. I try to just do some journaling, see what's there, see what comes. I have a couple of documents that I allow to be unformed documents without specific destinations or titles, and I can sort of pour writing into those and just, let them be. And then usually by the end of the morning, the juices are flowing and it's time to get to work on whatever it is I'm supposed to be doing.
Nice, useful practice, I think, for the rest of us. I'm especially curious because in this novel, a lot of it is about how our external circumstances dictate what's happening to us internally. These couples are both redoing their kitchens. Anna is oppressed by the renovation of the whole building. How do you feel physical situations reflect how you think about writing and life?
That's such a good question. It's so funny. I can't think at a table, so I can't work at a desk. I can only do my writing sitting cross-legged on the couch, which is not great, I have to say, for my neck and shoulders. I'm really trying to figure out a way to transform my writing practice. But so physically, I need to be in a situation where I'm comfortable, it's quiet around me. But then at the same time, I, being someone who lived in Paris for a long time, I also really enjoy a particular kind of work that I can get done in a cafe, where I'm there with my notebook and often a book, and I'll be taking notes, writing out, copying out sentences and stuff, and then kind of freestyling in the margins. And, interesting stuff can come. I'm sitting at a table. There's people all around me. So it's like the very opposite of my home situation. But I don't know. And that, whatever the soundtrack is, whatever music is playing, all of it can be very suggestive, or I'll write down what people are saying or write down what they're doing. So that can feel like another form of research, just going out into the world to take a bath in the world.
Now that you've moved to London, have you been able to, I won't say replicate, but find another version of that? Because to me, Paris cafe culture is so specific.
I know.
Have you found an equivalent in London?
Not really. There are some cafes near where I live that are okay. I really still like to ride on the bus, which, living in Southeast London, there are a lot of buses in my life. So, my obsession with riding on the bus has carried from one city to the next.
In 2019... Anna is haunted by the slogans of the Me Too movement that she sees around her in Paris. In 1972, in that part of the book, there's a trial going on in Paris which will lead to the legalization of abortion. It's a very monumental French case. And of course, France just recently became the world's first country to enshrine abortion in the Constitution. What did writing about these issues mean to you?
It's all incredibly deeply personal, right? I mean, as I was concluding, the first draft of the novel, Roe versus Wade, was overturned in our home country. And that was, it was just incredibly shocking to see 50 years of jurisprudence and just a way of life and a set of values just nullified and voided. And so I feel like, writing about 1972 didn't feel like historical fiction. It felt like, speculative fiction. Like, this is what's going to happen most likely in the US. And even in the UK, like, you have to get the approval of several different doctors, but it's still technically illegal, but your doctors can recommend that you have one. And so I don't know, it all feels incredibly pressing and important to be talking about these issues and finding ways to legislate them and to make sure that women's bodies are protected and women's rights to make choices over those bodies is protected.
You really engaged in 2019 for the French Me Too movement. How did the different texture of that movement in France, as I understand it, affect the novel? Because it seemed to have a different sensibility than what was going on in the UK or the US, in my understanding.
Yeah, it happened a little bit later. There was some Me Too stuff in France in 2017, but it took a little while to sink in. There was a lot of resistance to it at first. And I think it's very typical that it ended up taking a sort of grassroots form. This idea that there were like local groups of young women in different places around the country who were going out at night with their paper and their glue and their paint and pasting up these slogans on the walls, like, Daddy killed mommy, and in memory of Céline thrown out of a window by her husband on such and such a date. And it felt very direct, but also kind of surrealist in a deeply French way to have that be happening out in the public space, as if the buildings themselves were speaking to us, as if the walls had more of a sense of what was happening to women than people walking down the street. So I think that it's very subtle, but it's also inescapable and very much in your face when you're walking around the city.
You seem quite prolific. When I was listing all the books that you've written in my introduction, do you ever struggle with the blank page? Do you ever come and sit on your sofa and really think, I don't know what to do? And if so, how do you solve that problem?
Yeah, it's so funny. People tell me that, and I don't see why I seem so prolific. I'm 45 years old. I've written 4 books. That seems like an okay amount. But yeah, I've been struggling a lot, I have to say. In the last, I would say, 7 months or so, world events being what they are, I found it very hard to connect with the manuscript that I meant to deliver to my publisher in February. And so what I've been doing is just letting myself read. I've been returning to stuff that's been important to me that's not necessarily going to make it into this book that I'm writing, but that reminds me why I wanted to do this to begin with. So I've been reading some Walter Benjamin. I've been rereading Ruskin. Really, and Georges Perec's Ellis Island is just a very key text for me. I reread Moira Davies' Index Cards, which I just love that collection. So yeah, I've been trying to remind myself why writing was important / is still important, and what kind of lineage I'm writing into. And I don't know, hoping that on the other side of feeling like this, I'll be able to work on that manuscript again. Oh, there's also a Mary Beard book that was really crucial to me when I was thinking about doing the book, called Women in Power, which is about women's voices. And the book that I'm writing is about women's voices, mostly singing voices. But yeah, it's helping me reconnect with why that's relevant at a time of war and strife and, all of that.
This maybe leads to my next question, which is, how do you know when a book is finished? How do you know when you're ready to let it go?
I'm never really ready to let it go. Like, doing readings from this book, I'm like, oh God, not that happy with that sentence. So it's never really completely done. But yeah, I mean, if I feel like I've said what I wanted to say, and I feel like if I were to keep going, it would be messing with it too much, that's usually a good place to stop. When I feel just kind of that personal sense of like, yeah, okay, I got it.
I want to ask you a little bit about the reception of this book. It's only just coming out in the world, but there have been some wonderful reviews, and it seems to be doing very well in the bookstores. You mentioned before it feeling vulnerable to publish fiction. I'd like to interrogate that a little more, because I think some people might think it would be the opposite. That because fiction, you're writing about people who don't exist. Nonfiction, you have written about yourself. Why is that, do you think?
Maybe for some writers, they're just making stuff up and it doesn't feel like it has much bearing on their own lives. But even characters who are living through situations that I myself have never experienced, I mean, and that's like mostly everyone in the book, they're still made of me, and everything I've read and thought and, conversations I've had, stuff I've observed, stories other people have told me, it's all filtered through me. And that's why it feels much more personal, because it's about love and desire and loss and longing and history and place and Paris. And yeah, I mean, I'm also okay with the fact that it's quite a vulnerable experience. I say that, but I wouldn't have it any other way. I mean, I think when you're making art, you do have to open yourself up and show them what you've got, show them what you're working with, spill your guts, be honest. And if you're not being honest, then I'm not sure you're doing your job. So if I weren't really nervous and feeling a bit queasy every time someone sends me a review, then I probably would not have done my job properly.
After you finished the book, was there any particular reaction, perhaps from an agent or an early reader, that meant something special to you?
Yeah, I have a good friend called Shannon Smith, who is a brilliant writer and reader, and she just got it. I really trust her opinion. And she was like, yeah, you got it. And her notes were right on, and she saw stuff that I didn't see. And the book is better because I looked at it with her. I think she loved Clémentine. That's really reassuring.
That's the best kind of reader,
yeah,
isn't it? How do you consider your achievement in completing a novel now? Was there something that was particularly surprising about it to you?
I think, I didn't do an MFA, so I'm not coming from a place that's very reflective in terms of the craft of writing. I'm a critic and I have a PhD in English literature, but that is a completely different vernacular for looking at texts and thinking about texts. And often in my life, when I've heard MFA people talk about books, I felt somewhat left out, like I don't speak the same language or something. So I'm surprised that I managed to write a novel, given that I didn't know what I was doing. And it was all extremely intuitive. And then I was rereading James Wood's How Fiction Works this afternoon, thinking like, oh, I should maybe like give myself a little crash course in craft, if I'm going to write another one. And I felt the same feeling of like, I don't need to know how a car works to drive a car. Like maybe, okay, to get the metaphor right, to build a car, you should probably know how a car works. But since a book is not a car, I think I'm okay just kind of not looking too closely at the kinds of questions that James Wood is asking about voice and character and situation and detail. Maybe that's useful for a kind of revising stage, but certainly to get to another draft, I think I need to not be thinking about those kinds of questions. MFA people are listening to this going like, facepalm.
It sounds a little flippant sometimes to say, but to me the clue is in the word novel. Mm-hmm. It's new. Mm. And the trick is to reinvent it every time. And sometimes that reverse engineering can be useful, but not always and not for every writer. So we all have to find our own process, I think.
I think so too.
But it is a book that engages really deeply with many philosophical issues, as well as being a very gripping personal story. But it takes in how we think about ourselves, marital fidelity, how we perceive ourselves in our family histories, and the echoes that we leave in other people. What do you hope, if you have one, that readers will take away from this book?
I mean, what I was trying to do with all this stuff about infidelity and sex outside of marriage was to try to take fidelity outside of the realm of morality and think about it as a kind of ethics, and not to dictate, this is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't do. And not even for the characters to have a strong sense of what you should or shouldn't do or what's right and what's wrong, but for them to be kind of grasping as they go and making lots of mistakes. And I don't know, I would hope that the novel would in some way authorize the reader to like loosen up their own feelings about these shoulds and shouldn'ts, and to just try to live, their one wild and precious life with as much freedom as they possibly can, while acknowledging that we live in networks, we live amongst other people. Some of us live with other people in the same space, and they count and they matter, and we have to negotiate our own freedom through theirs. And so there's no easy answer, but I certainly don't think no sex outside of marriage is the answer. I don't think that's livable for anyone.
That's what I love about this book. One of the many things I love is it acknowledges difficulty. It acknowledges complexity. It lays these questions in front of us in the form of these characters, and then we live through them in reading the novel. It's just wonderful. Always at the end of our podcasts, we ask a set of questions to our subject. So now is the time for these questions. What is the most surprising thing you've learned from being a writer?
In terms of writing fiction, I was surprised to discover that I didn't have to have a plot or characters, that I could just kind of be some people in a situation and just follow through with that. I think I had an idea about what a novel was that came from growing up in America and having to read a lot of like late 20th century or post-Second World War realist fiction, and never recognized myself in any of it. And then I grew up and moved to France and read some French writers and was like, oh, I can write in this tradition.
Sticking with the theme of surprise, what would people be surprised to learn about you?
That I'm actually intensely shy and awkward and have a background in theater, so I'm very, very good at not letting that on most of the time. But I think if you're paying close attention, you can see through.
What is your idea of perfect happiness?
Oh, God, I would just say, like, very, very good childcare and some free time.
A very practical answer. What advice would you give to anyone who wants to express their creativity other than to have excellent childcare?
That is very important. I think you know, it sort of ties into what I was just saying about having grown up feeling like a novel was something that John Updike wrote or Philip Roth wrote. And those are great texts, but it's not the be-all and the end-all. Or even, you know, David Foster Wallace, another like person who looms large in my American childhood or teenage years. I would say, like, just write. Find your form. Find people who write stuff that you like and see if you can do what they do, and practice enough that you can get through to something that feels like yours. And when it feels like it's something that no one else can do, then you know you've tapped into your vitality or your voice.
In one word, how would you like to be remembered as a writer?
It's really hard to say. I like that you used the word complexity before, because I think often people try to make things out to be really simple and really straightforward. And I think I'm just someone who sees that it's all immensely complicated, or at least things are immensely complicated for me. But so I would like to think that I make complexity something you can reckon with. So I don't know if there's a word for that.
Our final question, if you can tell us or if you're thinking about it, what would you like your second novel to look like?
I would like for it to be compelling and for people to want to read on, you know, to get the premise and then keep going to see what happens. But for it similarly to carve out space for more freedom for people to not worry so much about what's appropriate and just try to live their lives with some kind of integrity and freedom.
Thank you so much, Lauren Elkin, for joining us on our podcast, Les Rencontres. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, and I hope we have a chance to talk again soon. I can't wait to read your next book.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Rendezvous littéraires Rue Cambon podcast. To discover more about it, you will find images, links, and references on the Chanel website. À bientôt!